This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. The Biden administration is pulling back an environmental review that cleared the way for a parcel of federal land that Apaches considered sacred to be turned over to a massive copper mining operation in eastern Arizona. The U.S. Department of Agriculture said Monday that it will likely take several months to further consult with Native American tribes and others about their concerns over Oak Flat and determine whether environmental review fully complies with the law. The agency cited President Joe Biden's recent memo on strengthening relationships with tribal nations and regularly consulting with them in a meaningful way. The Agriculture Department and the Forest Service acknowledged they can only do so much. Congress mandated that the land be transferred to Resolution Copper no later than 60 days after the final environmental review was published. That document was released in the last days of Donald Trump's administration. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee will consider Representative Deb Haaland's nomination to run the Interior Department at a hearing on Thursday. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who is chair of the Senate Energy Committee, said last week that he will vote for Haaland for the post, clearing the way for her likely approval as the first Native American to head a cabinet agency. Several Republican senators on the committee have said they will oppose her nomination, including James Lankford of Oklahoma and Steve Daines of Montana. If confirmed, Haaland, who is 60, would be the first Native American to lead a cabinet agency. She is from Laguna and Jemez Pueblos. As many as 10 death row inmates in Oklahoma, more than 1/5 of the state's prisoners condemned to die, could escape execution because of a recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling concerning criminal jurisdiction in Indian Country. The inmates have challenged their convictions in state court following the High Court's ruling last year, dubbed the McGirt decision. That determined a large swath of eastern Oklahoma remains an American Indian reservation. The decision means that Oklahoma prosecutors lack the authority to pursue criminal charges in cases in which the defendants or the victims are tribal citizens. Dozens of other inmates convicted in non-death penalty cases also are seeking to have their convictions tossed, which is expected to increase in a dramatic increase in the workload for federal prosecutors. One of the second to last known fluent Little Shell Chippewa Ojibwe speakers in Montana has died. According to the tribe's social media page, Duncan Standing Rock led the movement for the correct pronunciation of Chippewa Ojibwe, which is currently taught by Little Shell tribal members. He was the first person to assist in their tribal language program staff and started the work of developing the plans to revive the Little Shell Chippewa Ojibwe language in 2014. The city of Phoenix is officially installing new signs for 2 streets whose names have long been considered offensive. The new sign is called Piestewa Peak Drive, formerly Squaw Peak Drive. Historically, that word was used as a slur to describe Native American women. Piestewa honors fallen Native soldier Lori Piestewa. She was a member of the Hopi tribe and was killed during an ambush in Iraq in 2003. Officials will also unveil signage for Desert Cactus Street, formerly Robert E. Lee Street. Critics say having a street named for the Confederate general glorifies the pro-slavery Confederacy. The Phoenix City Council approved both names. Some residents disagreed, arguing it would force them to change their addresses on personal documents and records. A new program launched by South Dakota State University in partnership with the Indian University of North America focuses on ecosystem sustainability from a Lakota perspective. For the 10% of South Dakotans who are tribal members, the Black Hills are much more than an outdoor recreation spot. It's where the origin story begins. The program provides a semester-long immersive academic experience in Native American philosophy and located just north of Custer within view of the Crazy Horse Monument. Students from 7 Native nations participated in the first Wizipan class, but the program is also open to students who are not tribal members, students interested in learning more about sustainability founded on Lakota traditions. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Mark Trahant. When we come back, U.S. and Canada make a statement about Indigenous peoples. Last week, President Joe Biden and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met and discussed a number of issues facing the two countries. The two leaders put out a statement on the importance of Indigenous people and the significance of the Arctic in a changing climate. Raina Thiele has worked at the White House and planned President Obama's trip to the Arctic, the first ever by a sitting president. She has also worked at the Office of Management and Budget. She is Dena'ina, Athabaskan, and Yupik. Welcome, Raina.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
So what's the significance of President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau's meeting and their statement?
Well, I think it was a really interesting first meeting, and I think it was very encouraging. If you look at their joint statement, they talked a lot about Indigenous peoples and their involvement both in climate solutions and inclusivity of Indigenous groups. They talked about conservation led by Indigenous peoples. They also talked specifically about Indigenous peoples in the Build Back Better initiative, which of course President Biden has made a cornerstone of his administration. And so just to see the acknowledgement and inclusion of Indigenous peoples in that statement was incredibly encouraging. And also, of course, seeing that they really centered their commentary and their commitments around climate solutions, around protecting our biodiversity. To me, it was a very encouraging statement.
So much of the challenges in climate change really start in Alaska. How do the two nations, do you think, how will they work together on some of these issues and involve tribal communities?
Absolutely. Well, I think many of us saw just a couple of weeks ago that President Biden did push out a statement on tribal consultation. So this really builds on the statement that the executive order that Bill Clinton signed in his administration. It also builds on the presidential memo that, of course, President Biden put forward during his administration. And really, it's pretty remarkable because unlike what we've seen in the past, we had a president who really centered that consultation commitment very early in his administration. We haven't really seen that before. It's usually taken a few months to get there, but for this administration, they really made that a commitment that was very important to them right out of the gate, which I think is incredibly encouraging. And I know that Trudeau and Joe Biden both agree on that approach, of ensuring that First Americans and First Canadians, of course, are at the table, that they have a voice in projects and approaches to, of course, solving our climate crisis. And in Alaska, you're completely correct. We have, we're seeing outsized impacts from climate change, especially in the Arctic. We see that the shipping routes are opening up in the Arctic oceans. And I think it's incredibly encouraging that President Biden was able to reinstate the executive order, creating the Bering Sea Climate Resilience Area, which is, of course, a tribally led and elder-led initiative, which is incredibly encouraging. We also saw that the two leaders talked about ANWR, and they are, both interested in protecting ANWR and ensuring that the porcupine caribou herd are healthy into the future. So I think just between the two statements and between their sort of shared commitments around the environment and climate, that we are going to see a very, very different approach to governance and their bilateral relationship going forward.
I know you've worked on global Arctic issues, and I'm wondering what kind of changes do you expect to come from the Biden administration and how it deals with other Arctic nations?
Well, I think that, we had such an incredibly strong approach to Arctic policy under President Biden. We had an Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which was very active at the White House. We had a special rapporteur at the Department of State for Arctic issues domestically. And of course, we were the chair of the Arctic Council at that time. I think going forward, we're going to see that there's a renewed focus on the Arctic. And I think that really has to be the case at this point, because as we look at the changes from climate and those impacts, you really see a preview of what's going to happen globally when you look to the Arctic. And so, of course, when we think about the Arctic in the US, we, of course, have to work with our Canadian allies to ensure that, we're innovating, we're mitigating, we're adapting, and we're helping to solve this crisis, because we have literal communities in the Arctic that are nearing, the state where they could fall into the sea, right? Because of rising sea levels, erosion. We see that storm events are, incredibly impacting incredibly in the coastal areas of our state. And so in order to solve this crisis and to take aggressive action, you really need to take the cue from the Arctic.
Well, in fact, of all the international bodies, really, the Arctic Council is the only one that includes Indigenous voices as part of the process.
Yes, and I think it's so incredibly important, and we don't see enough of it. I mean, if we look across the various different international mechanisms that exist, we see kind of varying levels of this involvement of Indigenous groups, but it's been proven internationally that if you look at regions that are managed or owned by Indigenous peoples, 80% of our globe's biodiversity are in those areas that are managed by Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples and the relationship that we have to our lands and our waters cannot be overstated. I mean, it's incredibly important to recognize that connection, which, in this agreement that we saw between Trudeau and Biden, you see that very clearly. You see that they talk about Indigenous-led land management and conservation. They talk about climate solutions that are led by Indigenous groups. I think those are all incredibly exciting statements, especially this early in an administration. And it's really long overdue. We really need to focus our efforts on leaning into the knowledge and the life ways of Indigenous peoples and having them lead on these issues, because since time immemorial, they have been the stewards and the best stewards of these lands and waters.
Well, earlier you mentioned resilience, and so much of the story about climate change is almost dystopian. It's a terrible future when there are other things going on that are equally fascinating.
Yeah, and it absolutely. I mean, I think we can look at this one of two ways. We can see this as a very defeatist state that we're in currently, where we don't have any options to solve this crisis. We see the storm events that are occurring. We see drought. We see forest fires beyond what we've seen in the past, and it can be very discouraging. But then we also see the agreements of the Canadian government with its Indigenous groups in their Indigenous Guardians programs, where they've basically turned over large parts of public lands management to tribes across their country. We see that the US government is really kind of rounding that corner right now when it comes to Indigenous-led management. Of course, we have, Deb Haaland, who is the nominee for Secretary of the Interior. And I think we're setting ourselves up right now for a very historic moment where we can make really important, significant change. And I think we can really turn this around. And that kind of hopefulness, I think, is really what we need, especially in the time of COVID, when everyone is feeling a little defeatist. And how do we go forward from here? I think that there are solutions if we choose to go in that direction, and that they are good solutions and they're ones that we can achieve.
There still remains pretty sharp differences of opinion between Canada and the United States, particularly on infrastructure issues. How do you see those being resolved?
Absolutely. Well, we did see that the Keystone Pipeline was stopped by the Biden administration. The Canadian government, of course, in Trudeau's statement, he did express disappointment that happened. But I think we're going to see more of that. If we look back to the Obama-Biden administration, DAPL, Keystone, those were all on the chopping block, right, for good reason. And I think that we'll see more of that as we go forward. And it'll just be one of those things that the two leaders will have to work through. But I do think that it's a good indication from the US government and President Biden of the direction that he's moving in. And I think that with all of the different points of agreement that the two of them have around climate and environmental issues, that they will have plenty to work on, even outside of these pipelines.
We only have a minute left, so I just want to ask kind of a closing question. And what brings you most hope in dealing with Arctic issues?
I think what brings me the most hope is seeing a lot of our younger leaders really rise to the occasion. We have many folks who have gone back to their communities, who are working, feet on the ground, working with their community members, trying to solve the issues, the day-to-day issues that are facing folks in their communities, right? They're getting to know their governance structures. They are getting to know governance structures, not just on the local and tribal level, but also on the national level, on the state level. And I think we are better equipped now than we ever have been before to deal with this crisis, and to do it in a way that's self-determined and that really leans into nationhood and sovereignty and seeks those solutions that are based in our native values and lifeways. And that's what brings me the most hope about helping protect our Arctic and, of course, mitigate climate change.
Thank you, Raina.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll be right back. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has announced the appointment of Zach Ducheneaux as the administrator for the Farm Service Agency. Until recently, Ducheneaux was executive director of the Intertribal Agriculture Council, the largest long-standing Native American agriculture organization in the United States. He is a member and has been a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribes Council, and he operates a family ranch in South Dakota. It goes without saying that Ducheneaux is the first Native American to head this agency within the Agriculture Department. To put this appointment into perspective, we reached out to Janie Hipp. She is the president and CEO of the Native American Agriculture Fund. Janie, how significant is Zach Ducheneaux's appointment?
Mark, it is extremely significant. I have to remind everyone that the Farm Service Agency at USDA is one of two banks at USDA, and the other bank is over at Rural Development, and they do all rural economic development. The bank that is over on Zach's side of the house now, which is wonderful to say, is the bank that deals with farm lending. And they do literally lending for ownership of agricultural operations, farms and ranches, and they do operating loans for people all over the country. And they've been around since the beginning of that department. And it's not lost on me that the Native American Ag Fund came about because of discrimination in lending. And there was the Keep Siegel case that was brought on all Native farmers and ranchers' behalfs that knocked around in the litigation arena for almost 20 years. And now the fund is up and running. And now we look, and Zach Ducheneaux, a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, is the administrator of the Farm Service Agency, against which we actually sought compensation for discrimination. So it's never happened to have a Native person who is the head of that agency, but it also is so pivotal that it was Zach. And the reason why I say that, Mark, is Zach is one of our nation's experts on how agricultural lending is not quite right now. And this has been my career as well. And we've got, as a country, to get it right on how we extend capital and credit to all farmers and ranchers. We're in the middle of an intergenerational shift within the agricultural sector. Younger people, we need them to stay in the game and with us, no matter who they are. And he really has come up through his own personal experience as a rancher, but also through his role as executive director and kind of coming up the ranks of Intertribal Ag Council. You know, Intertribal Ag Council was created in the 80s farm financial crisis. And they emerged from that really pivotal and horrible time period for all the country's farmers and ranchers, but it hit us worse than anybody. And to have Zach with that deep, deep knowledge of how hard it is to actually extend credit to farmers and ranchers and how we actually should be thinking about it in a different way at this critical moment, not just for native producers, but for all producers who are really thinking about who's coming up behind us, but also how do we do agriculture for the next 100 years facing climate changes that are way beyond just the normal disasters that we all have to face. It's hailstorms are not what they used to be. Tornadoes are bigger than they used to be. Derechos are coming through, our agricultural systems. And I want Indian country to understand how groundbreaking it is for Zach to be in that role. And I will tell you, we all need to pray for him every single day, because that is one of the most complicated agencies within USDA's portfolio, but it's also one that is so important for the country, but also for Indian country's future. The agricultural economic development and food economy development we need to do so that we never have to face critical shortages of food, we can do that. That is within our power. But to have him, and he's so thoughtful around all of these issues, but also so deeply knowledgeable, and he really looks out into the future. And I just think it's going to be exciting for him to be in that role for everybody, not just us. But it is sort of a big deal.
How is agriculture changing, shifting from an industry to being about food?
COVID showed us again how critical these linkages are between where food is grown and what's grown and how do we get to it and how can we get it to people. And, we don't know, some of us live in that crisis all the time, but some of us don't. And COVID showed us that we've got a lot of work to do in these spaces. And, Zach knows the inner workings of how those disconnects can happen. He's, if you ever have followed, I follow him around and several other people, we see it at meetings when we used to go to them. But he's so thoughtful around these issues. And it's, we all have to be thinking about food security. And it's not just, can I get enough calories? Do I know where my food is? We need to be planning for our future now. And that strategic planning around food is critical. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of folks kind of ignored the need to actually bring capital and credit into the conversation, because I have yet to find a functioning food system that didn't need an economic leg. It's just a stark reality of what we all need to put our heads around. It's much more than just dealing with the social or environmental or production issues. We have to think about the capital piece of it as well. And he understands how that works, and he's not afraid to actually lean into the question, are we doing this right? And he talks about patient capital. I don't like crises, but sometimes they show us what we need to be looking at. And I think this is one of those times. And so to have someone like Zach, who really has thought about it at that deep and layered level, it's not just a business, it's our communities. But it's not just our communities, it's also a business. And we got to figure out how those pieces work together. And by golly, we better have some young people coming up behind us who are ready to take these important leadership positions on within our communities to feed us. Because not everybody wants to do it and not everybody can do it. Not everybody's cut out to do it. but I know those young people are out there, and Zach and their organization have spent so many years really nurturing the next generation. And that's a part of the mission of Farm Service Agency also. But anyway, I'm glad you called today, Mark, because I've just been wanting to scream from the rooftops about how important this is and how exciting it is, but also how we need to rally around Zach and really help him do his job as well as he possibly can, because it's a really critical time for somebody like him with his life experience to actually be there.
Thank you, Janie Hipp. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another edition tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahant.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.